Lola, thank you so much for joining us on the Rising Beyond podcast today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I am delighted to be here.
Yeah, we are going to talk about, right, the topic of my podcast is surviving domestic violence and coercive control. And we're going to start there. And yet we're going to move into some how to heal as you find an identity through different areas and different means. And so I'm super excited to talk about that because that is something that honestly is needed as we heal. Whatever you feel comfortable sharing with us about the domestic violence in your history, we'd like to just get some context about why we're going to be talking about what we're talking about later.
Well, I was married quite young at age 20. I was madly in love. He was so different from any other person I'd met, male or female. An athlete, tall, blonde, gorgeous, in a very chiseled Nordic way. Super nice guy. He specialized in downhill skiing. And in his downhill skiing, he specialized in teaching children. So he loved children. He seems like a nice guy, comes from a good family. His parents were well educated. And his mother as well, which was not the norm really for a woman who would have been born in 1930, I believe. And his dad was a professional in the medical field. So it seems like I was marrying a nice guy into a good family. My parents liked him and he knew how to schmooze, but in a nice, genuine way. Things were good. He did drink a little too much for my liking. It was unusual. More than that, his personality would change, which I later learned was a classic profile of an alcoholic, which he finally admitted, by the way, and he finally stopped drinking. And he's been sober for, 40 years now, which is absolutely awesome. But during the entirety of our 5-year marriage, he was not violent. He was a bully. He would tower over me. He was an athlete. In the summertime, he did water ski instruction and hang gliding instruction. So he was an athlete who'd been athletic, started skiing at age 2. So a super athlete. But when you have someone like that towering over you and 5'5", that in itself is intimidating. And he could be verbally abusive when he'd been drinking, like shut up and that kind of stuff. Mild, but definitely didn't endear him to me. It was after we split up, and I was pretty sure this was part of the end game. It was after I left him, in fact, that one day when I came back to get our son from a visit, he was very violent. He beat me, my face, he throws me on the floor, beats my face. I actually had an out of body. I'm not sure if it was near death, but it certainly felt like that. And our son was nearby. He was age 3. And the reason, amongst many, but the main reason I wanted to leave, maybe 2 main reasons. I couldn't live like that under the threat of violence.
Yep.
And I didn't want our son to absorb this as normal behavior and normalize it and say, oh, it's okay for me as an adult to tower over my girlfriend or wife and yell at her and call her names and be abusive verbally. So those were 2 main reasons. Anyway, I thought when he passed out. And I talk about this in my book. He passed out and I thought, this is it. I can grab our son and flee. And I didn't quite make it to the front door. And I had been, about to core an apple for our son. So I had left a paring knife handy, which could have been really devastating. But my husband threatened to slice my face. He's waving this paring knife in my face if I left him. So I said, okay, I'll stay. I'm no fool. I'll stay. I'm good. Anyway, I did sneak out in the middle of the night. And that was the last time that he was violent. He realized that nothing was going to make me stay. And he also realized that I wasn't the wife he wanted. But that was pretty tense. And I had delayed leaving as long as I did. It probably took me 2.5 years to make the decision to leave because I was pretty sure his violence would manifest itself somehow.
Yeah. And what you bring up is really common because, right, there's this belief of like, well, if he's abusive, why don't you just leave? Well, one, there's all these, right? Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh, great. I'll see you later.
Yeah. There's this idea of, and now we're learning more about it, but people would not have said he was abusive to you. Right? You didn't have a black eye. There was no abuse. And the other piece that it brings up is people believe that once you leave, you are safe then.
Oh.
And guess what? It's actually the time that is the scariest for someone leaving is that year after they have left. That year after is the most dangerous time for a victim of abuse. And unfortunately, you experienced all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
I actually didn't realize at the time that it was. I mean, I guess I did. I internalized that, yes, that was going to be a very dangerous time because he was angry. He was hurt. Everything that he identified with as being masculine, being the provider, being the good husband, being the good father, was obviously called into question if his wife was leaving. And in 1979, although I certainly was not the first woman in the entire history of the world to leave her husband, it was not common.
Hmm.
And in my aviation career, I had one fellow, and again, I talk about this in my memoir, who would say things like, well, why did you leave your husband? He couldn't believe it. He said, surely your husband left you. I said, no. He said, well, why would anyone leave a marriage? Why would anyone leave a man? How are you managing to survive? Well, it's like, gee, I'm sitting beside you flying an airplane, so I think I'm doing okay. But yeah, at one point he said, well, isn't a bad husband better than no husband?
Wow.
Yeah, shocking. He also asked, what he actually said was, so how come you can't keep a husband? And I explained, what makes you think that he left me? And then he said, I bet he left you because you don't like sex. It's like, no.
Right? You're like,
He didn't leave.
well, and there's this like the not understanding that women are capable and women can want things and women are not just homemaker. And I'm sure back, yeah, in the 70s and 80s, that was much more shocking and strange than it is now. But
It
I
was.
still see those undercurrents.
Yes,
They're still there.
they are.
They're still present. And we are going to talk about your shift and gaining identity in the world of aviation and being a pilot and all those things, which that is a very male dominated profession still.
It hasn't changed much. When I was flying, it was about 96% male in a commercial occupation. So it's a little bit closer, not much, but maybe in the private pilot world, maybe 10% of pilots are female and then obviously 90. But in commercial aviation, it was about 96% male to 4% female. And it hasn't changed much. It's still slightly increased to maybe 5 to 6% female. So 95% male.
Yeah.
With India being the one exception. And for about 45 to 50 years, they have had 15% female commercial pilots, which is remarkable.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's right? It's like something you wouldn't really think about of in other areas, other cultures, having that be a piece of it.
The India connection, I think, is because we're talking about the upper echelon. It is a caste system still. And the upper echelon or the wealthy will not only suggest careers for their children. You have 5 kids, you're going to say, okay, you'll be an engineer, you'll be a doctor, you'll be a lawyer, you can be a pilot, you can be a professor at university. They not only suggest it, they encourage them, and they support them financially and emotionally, hence the 15%. It's still not great, but it's certainly better than 5 or 6% for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So share a little bit about how you became a pilot and right. So you're already having your own path of leaving a husband and now you're going to be a pilot.
Right. So it was actually something he did after I passed my private pilot flight test was the impetus for me to just end it. I'd been thinking about it. We had actually changed homes. He got a promotion, so we moved. I was working in the banking industry, so I did have a good job, or have a job, in fact, but it was a pretty good job as well. So I did have an income, but even then with an income and a house, I guess my main concern was how it would affect our son, right? So got my private pilot license. And it's also interesting because he was the one that even though I'd wanted to be a pilot for a long time, his dad and his uncle, so 2 brothers, had airplanes. They were private pilots. They actually had 3 airplanes between them. And so one day, my then husband, Paul, came home and said, let's take flying lessons. And I was shocked. We were in a small community in southwestern Ontario in Canada. Like, where am I going to take flying lessons? Oh, he says, I found this school. Okay. So here's a man that I want to leave, and yet he's very supportive. But once I got my license, he became, or got close to getting my license, he became very increasingly controlling and would interrupt me when I was talking to brag about me. So it's one thing for him to brag to his friends, hey, my wife's getting her pilot's license. And by the way, Paul was also studying and getting his pilot's license too. I just happened to get it first. So I did the flight test at a school different than the one I started at, which meant that my first instructors, the first 20 hours, didn't know I'd passed my flight test. So of course, this to me is remarkable. Like, wow, I actually am a pilot now. I can fly an airplane. I can do almost anything, right? That's really the feeling. If I can do this, I can do almost everything. However, I had to go to work on that the Tuesday after the flight test. And I, of course, wanted to call my instructors at this first school. By the time I got a chance to do it, I was a supervisor. It took me a while to get away from the bank to make a personal phone call. My instructor, the chief pilot, said, wow, we're so excited for you. And at first I thought, well, maybe the one school had connected with the other school because they had been talking back and forth anyhow. But no, it was my husband who, at least in my mind at that time, had taken away the only moment of glory I'd probably ever have in my entire life to say, hey, guess what? I got my pilot license. I'm so excited. And now I'm going to stay at your school and do my commercial license. But he'd taken that from me. So actually on that very day, I made time to find myself a place to live nearby. I worked about 20 miles away from where we lived. And on the drive home, I rehearsed what I was going to say. And I was terrified. I was really terrified. But I just thought, I'm doing this. I'm out of here. It was so empowering. And there was no one else that I could rely on in the sense of when you're up there in the air, you have to rely only on yourself. I mean, yes, there's heroic actions where the air traffic control in the tower talks you down or something. But generally, you are responsible for yourself. So if I can do that, hey, I'm on my way to doing almost anything.
Yeah. And someone who doesn't understand, who's never been in a coercively controlling relationship would be like, well, was it really that big of a deal that he called? Like, it's not that big a deal. You're making a huge big deal out of this.
Yes.
But it is a pattern of those types of things of, I can't let her feel good. I have to remove any power that she has that I have control over so that I feel like I have maintained control.
So well said. And you are so correct. And in fact, in the various workshops, and I even had a developmental editor say, what's the fuss?
The big deal.
It's just a phone call. So I really had to work on the earlier part of that to explain why this was such a big deal.
Yes.
It was also the icing on the cake, admittedly, but it was done. I was out of there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
You're so right. And in fact, I remember thinking, what? They don't understand how important this is. And yet there are people who don't know they're abused.
Yeah.
And they don't realize it, or they're not willing to admit it, perhaps. My husband and I, my current wonderful, loving husband of 26 years, and I were out a few weeks ago at a local restaurant, and we ran into two couples that we know marginally. And the first couple, everything he said, and we knew him better than her. And any time we'd ever really talked to, we'd actually encountered them hiking. He did all the talking. So I didn't really think that much about it. But this time in his talking, he was telling her to be quiet, to shut up. He told her how horrible her first house was, inherited money. And at age 21, she bought a house, which I thought was remarkable.
Yes.
And okay, so maybe it wasn't in, the luxury area, but it was a house and it was a nice house. It was modest, but he did nothing but denigrate her and interrupt her. That was shocking enough. Another couple came along, the male partner of the couple, and he said, oh yeah, my wife and I are just over here. I'll tell her to come, that you're over here and to come chat with you. Seems very nice on the surface, right? She comes over a little bit later, and in that 20 or 30-minute conversation in which she came over to chat with us, my husband and me, Her partner, her husband came over 4 times to say, you should go talk to, and you should go talk to. So he's very controlling. So on the way home, my husband says, so I guess I'm not so bad after all, am I? Because he picked up on that too. He was just astonished. It was kind of a joke because he's a wonderful man. But, I do have some things, I guess, about him.
There are these patterns that if you don't see them or they are normal in your circle, in your family of origin, they would not be seen at all as coercion or abuse or maybe even controlling. And yet, if you have been in it or you work within it and you see it all the time, you can see the more subtle patterns that are there. And a lot of the subtle patterns that aren't seen is due to patriarchy and our patriarchal society of the beliefs about men and the beliefs about women.
You're absolutely right. The other interesting thing in our language informs us as well. So in Canada and in Britain, I think in the Commonwealth, when you get a pilot license, it's called, not surprisingly, a pilot license. In America, it's called an airman license. I don't understand why people don't pick up on that. I mean, there was a fuss about it a couple of years ago, and one woman wrote in to say, but I've always wanted to be an airman, just like my dad. And I felt like saying, honey, unless you have a sex change, you're never going to be an airman.
Yeah. Yeah. Just even the language that's out there is very male dominated. So as you got your pilot's license, you started working within the industry. How long have you been working within aviation?
Well, I worked there in the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I then moved into a different field. This exclusion is no longer valid, but at the time, you could not wear corrective lens and be hired by a major air carrier. So I decided I didn't want to fly these sort of milk routes forever, and I branched off and moved to Mexico. I became a scuba dive master and studied the Maya of Mesoamerica, which will be my next book.
Oh, amazing. And with each of those, I alluded to this, and we're going to jump in because you just brought me right there, is becoming a pilot really was a huge piece, I would say, after our conversation of how you healed from the abuse you experienced. It gave you a sense of identity that maybe you did not have. And then as you're talking about, hey, I just got my master scuba instructor things, I have all of these different ways of not even changing, but adding to the different parts of your identity and being who you are. And so tell me a little bit about how being a pilot specifically helped you find that identity and heal.
It was a real sense of accomplishment. Even though I had been proud to work in the Bay, I was still very, very astonished, really. Even when I went solo the first time, it was like, wow, this is me. Sometimes it's still maybe hard to believe, but it took a lot of hard work and determination. It also gave me focus, right? I didn't focus when I started flying. I didn't focus on getting my airline transport license. I focused on finishing the private license, then doing the commercial, then doing other ratings, a night rating, an instructor rating, a multi-engine rating, an instrument rating. And so I took it step by step by step. And I think that's important too, that yes, you want to have an end goal relating to marriage. My end goal, unfortunately, after about 2.5 years was leave, but it took me a while to do it. I did it in steps and I had to think about it and weigh everything. But it also, it broadened my horizon. It increased my knowledge base. At times it was difficult because being the only female, at one point I overheard a conversation with 2 or 3 of the pilots with whom I had just started working. And the conversation, in a nutshell, one of the guys says, boobs don't belong in a cockpit. And that was the gist of the conversation. So I remember thinking, and I wrote it again in the book, that here I think I've left an abusive relationship with one man to enter an abusive relationship with several men. Now, thankfully, they didn't comprise the entirety of the male population, but it gave me strength because I knew that I had stood up to my bullying husband, who was primarily a bully. Yes, he was controlling, but a bully, as opposed to coming home every night and beating me up, which I suspect does happen to these bullying men as well, who didn't want me there. But I didn't take it personally because by then I had a pretty healthy feeling about myself. Even when my husband was belittling me, I thought, you're wrong, buddy. I never really bought into that, which I know is a big thing. People get beaten down and finally believe that they are not able to do something or not powerful enough or not intelligent enough or not something, whatever it is, enough, not good enough. And that's wrong. I mean, you may not ever be, going to the moon. I'm never going to go to the moon. I'm not going to be a ballet dancer. I like to do high altitude trekking, but I'm not going to climb Everest. But all of this is empowering, even just taking that first step, having enough confidence in yourself or believing in yourself and working commercially and saying, I am doing this. The guys would say, well, why do you think you got hired? And I was like, well, because I'm a qualified pilot who took the same exams and flight tests as you did. Oh, no. We think you got hired because the chief pilot wants to sleep with you.
Huh?
Yeah. So there were downsides, but I also want to emphasize that they were having as much trouble with me in the sense of adjusting to a female on the job. Yes, they would have preferred a guy. I got hired instead of one of their friends. There was a bit of resentment there, but in their frame of reference, they'd never met a female pilot. They didn't know any professional female women, unless maybe they'd gone to university, but that was only 2 of about 15 guys. They were not accustomed to women succeeding or women succeeding in a profession, and certainly not women succeeding in aviation. So they were having a hard time too. So I never took it personally. Right. They didn't say, oh, Lola, she's a crappy pilot. She doesn't belong in the airplane. They said, boobs don't belong in the cockpit.
Yeah. And what do you think needs to change? Because there are a lot of women in male-dominated professions, and they are more likely to be harassed, sexually assaulted than if they are in a female-dominated industry. What do you think can shift or needs to shift, or what are just your thoughts on how to shift the culture to not allow that to be even commonplace or accepted?
It is shifting a bit. There are sort of the more recent commercial pilot graduates who are male have now, in most cases, even in small communities in Ontario and Canada, so presumably in America as well, they would have seen at least 1 or 2 other female pilots. There might even be a female instructor on staff, or they may get hired at a company that has 1 female pilot or more than 1 female pilot. So things are changing a bit. It's not like I was the second person to arrive at any place I worked at. I was the first, almost any place I worked at, I was the first female pilot to be hired for that company. So there is a shift. That's important. But what we need to do is shift our attitudes, even at home, about which chores are appropriate for men and women. I think they're all appropriate or not appropriate. Who wants to do them anyway? But nonetheless, there is still that gender assignation for specific chores. So that needs to change. And what also needs to change is our attitudes to what we buy for our little girl or what we buy for our little boy. And that's hard because we're products of our environment too, and how our parents raised us and what we saw on TV. Little girls in frilly pink ballerina tutus and boys in, army gear sort of stuff. But in the schools, we need to have more parent-student days where non-traditional occupations are encouraged. More information needs to be in our schools about these careers. And I know that in talking with other people, because I'm actively involved in outreach and speaking for the local chapter of the International Organization of Women Pilots, the 99s, and for the Northern Lights Aero Foundation. I speak to schools, to service clubs, and at many schools, even if you go to the guidance counselor, they don't know much about non-traditional careers unless you show a tremendous aptitude for math or science, and clearly you want to go in that direction. They'll encourage you. But let's say you're faltering. And I've even heard of people saying, I want to have a career in aviation. They say, oh, go join the military. That is certainly an opportunity. And you can go join the military and become a military pilot. But that's not the only route. And they're just not aware of it. So we need to get into the schools, the teachers, the guidance counselors, and at university as well. It does happen. I mean, even in the 80s, I went to schools at careers days, and they did encourage women in non-traditional occupations to speak. Car mechanic, I've yet to see a female car mechanic. A friend of mine does car repair maintenance, but she does it on classic cars. But as a general rule,
Right.
there are not many female that I've never seen one. I'm sure there are some, but that sort of stuff. But if you have a special aptitude for one of the STEM related careers or STEM careers, yeah, you're probably going to get good guidance. But otherwise, I mean, there's so many careers in aviation, like 40. It's not just being a pilot. We're not up there on our own. There's a lot of careers you can do. And yet the guidance counselors at schools and universities just seem to gloss over them. And I don't know why, especially since commercial aviation. When I took my first flight, it was 1962, and it took us 2 airplanes to get from Toronto to Regina, which is sort of like going from, I don't know, like Buffalo to Colorado. It took us 2 planes to get there. You couldn't even just fly nonstop. It was amazing, right? I had to wear this little, I didn't have to. I wanted to wear my little posh frock. We got dressed up. It was amazing. People didn't fly, but now they do. And yet still people don't think I can be something other than a flight attendant, which is fine.
Yeah.
If you want to be a flight attendant, totally fine. But there's a host of other careers associated with aviation that people seem to gloss over.
Yeah. And do you think within the smaller culture, so this is a separate like very separate and related. So in a recent episode, I interviewed about officer-involved domestic violence. So police, like law enforcement. And some of the conversations that we talked about is that in order for the culture to shift, men will have to be some of the loudest speakers.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if in the pilot world, and you and I talked about this offline, I think the first time we talked about that there's a very unique and higher percentage in my practice of certain jobs or careers of the abusers of my clients. And pilot was one of them. Law enforcement was another.
Shocked. Yes. Law enforcement, I think I've known that for several years, but I was a little shocked about pilots. But it is a big control thing. And if you feel that for whatever reason you're losing control, you're going to hang on more tightly. I think a lot of that macho attitude is changing, because a lot of it was like, hey baby, I can fly an airplane, and you go to a bar, and I talk about this. You go to a bar, if you're a guy, well, you're going to be very successful.
Yes.
In picking up girls. But for me, if I said, if I went out with the guys, I was mistaken for the flight attendant or the stewardess, as they were then called, for the front desk staff or the ticket agent. It was like, no, why do you think I'm not a pilot? They're pilots. I'm a pilot. And I've had guys cover their genitals and sort of back away laughing like, no, I don't think I want to deal with you because obviously you're a ball breaker. And I say,
yeah. Yep.
And it wasn't true. I think my relationships have been fairly normal relationships, but I know there are some guys who just sort of backed off. So the guys need to speak out and support women. And I know on the Northern Lights Aero Foundation, on their board of directors, there is a man who I believe is involved with one of the major air carriers in Canada. And so that's a supportive inclusion rather than just having, a bunch of women in one area and looking like we don't want the support of men, but we do want the support of men. Absolutely.
Yeah. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, is I believe that we need to fully be listened to, which is the part that's like frustrating and obnoxious, but to fully be listened to in certain areas, we do need male voices in support of, because it's less than us versus them, right? It's like we can listen to a male who is supporting more than we can listen to the female that is yelling from the megaphone really loudly trying to get support. And so I do believe that in that culture shift, we need men to be a huge part of the culture shift.
We do. And it needs to start at home. And it's not just the woman or the wife, the female partner, saying it without the support of her male partner. It needs to be a joint event. And people need to be aware. In order to change, though, we need to be aware that we're following in the footsteps of our parents and making judgments and decisions based on gender and what our children or grandchildren are capable of based on gender. Obviously, there are some limitations, obviously. Generally, you just can't assume that your daughter is any less intelligent than your son or any less capable. And yet I sometimes think that, again, the change there, in that case, the change might have to come from the woman at this point, because women are still, in most cases, but not all, they may be working as much as their male partner, but there's still that assumption that they're going to be the primary caregiver or do more of the work at home involving children. So I think that needs to change too.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, this is going to be a slower process, slower change than a lot of us would like. I am not the most patient of people, but I wanted to end if there was some sort of motivational tip or something that you could share with a woman who likely has been beat down to the point where they are not sure they're capable. They've been told that they are irresponsible with money, that they are stupid, that they are really not worth anything, either by direct words or by behaviors. And they had a dream before they were with this person that has beat them down. How could they reignite that desire or that belief that they can do the thing?
I think they should just do it, in the sense of take that first step. So if we're talking about aviation, maybe it's university or college or finishing high school, just start taking classes, start taking lessons or flight lessons, and you will be able to do it. I mean, if you sit here or at your home and you think, oh, I'll never get my pilot's license, or I'm a failure, I can't get my grade 12, I can't finish university, or whatever, I didn't finish university. Start taking baby steps to whatever it is you've chosen as your goal. And the equivalent would be, I actually just got a letter this morning from a woman who I'm working with writing, and she said, oh, I think what I've written, I'm not sure I like it. I said, don't worry. You've just started on this journey. I said the equivalent would be if on your fifth lesson in flying, because she's a pilot as well, on your fifth lesson of flying, you were worrying if you ever going to get hired by Air Canada. It's just too long a goal. So break your goals down, one end goal for sure, but break your goals down into manageable segments. I'm going to take flying lessons. I'm going to go solo. I'm going to get my private license, and then so on and so forth. Or I'm going to take one course at college, high school, university, and it's going to be a night class. Or I'm going to take online learning now. It's a big thing, obviously. Some kind of correspondence program, or I'm going to go in person one night a week. And you can manage that. You can't probably manage, or maybe you can. If you can manage to quit your job and leave your husband and go back to school full time, go for it. But that may not be, that may be a bit radical. Take that one course at night. Your husband, partner can look after the children, whatever, and don't listen to anyone who says you can't do it.
Yeah. And that there is that in finding that intrinsic motivation and belief in yourself. And this is what I talk about all the time, is putting the people around you, the community around you, that will be your greatest cheerleaders, that see your worth, that see that you're capable. And when you don't feel capable, you are there to look to them, and they will mirror your capability back to
yes,
you.
You can find allies. That's important. And if it's not your partner, that's really unfortunate, but find someone who it is. Maybe it's the teacher. Maybe it's the flight instructor. Maybe it's a guidance counselor. Maybe it's your best friend, or maybe it's your mom or dad. Someone in your community. I'd like to hope that there's someone in your community. Maybe you need to go to a crisis center. Maybe there's someone there, or the health units. I don't know how the system works exactly in America, but it's
a hot mess.
Yes. Well, we have a hot mess. Yes, it's a hot mess here too. But you can go. So, for example, my sister quit smoking. She couldn't do it on her own. I think she could have, but she thought she couldn't. But what she did do was she went to a health unit, and she worked with this counselor. And because the counselor believed in her, she didn't want to let the counselor down. So she quit. And that was 10 years ago.
And go ahead and say, with each of those small victories that you were talking about, like a victory of step 1, victory of step 2, victory of step 3, your confidence will also start to grow.
Absolutely. Yay, I passed this exam. Yay, absolutely. Yeah. Whatever it is. It's like running a mile. You're not going to step out the door and run a mile. What is it, a 2-minute mile or something today, if you've never run before? But you might run down the block, I don't know, 100 yards or whatever. And you feel good about yourself. So the next day you do 200 yards or 300, whatever. Everything has to be taken in incremental steps. Otherwise, even if you feel confident and have 100% confidence in yourself, that end goal that's years away is so unattainable because it's years away and it looks too big and you can't do it.
Mhm.
So just break it down into little chunks.
Yeah. Yeah. And if people would like to hear more about your book, share just a little bit about what they can expect.
Well, it's about aviation, as you might guess, highway to the sky, an aviator's journey. But aviation is just the theme that drives or propels the story forward. And that story was the dream of a little girl who wanted to be a pilot, whose dad said, "Don't be silly." How pejorative is that? Don't be silly. Girls don't fly airplanes. And I continued with that dream and achieved that dream eventually as a 24-year-old. And it talks about abuse. It talks about bullying. It talks about getting into and out, falling in love, being madly in love, realizing that wasn't quite the right choice. So we hit a lot of topics here, but it's really about success, believing in yourself, facing your fears. In this case, leaving my husband, getting in an airplane. Oh my gosh. A little one that I was going to learn to fly. But that was pretty scary. So facing your fears, overcoming your fears, realizing that you can overcome your fears and becoming the person you were meant to be is what it's about. Achieving your dreams, building the life you want. And it will relate to so many people in so many ways. Yes, I talk a little bit about aviation, absolutely, but it just drives that story forward. So it's really about women's issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think finding your place, finding your confidence and who you can be, even if you've been told you're nothing.
Yes.
That is not true, right? That is what they want you to believe so that they can continue to have control over you in some way, whether that's your partner or someone in your family of origin or someone else, a coworker, right? If you do not believe in your capabilities, you are more likely to be controlled by other people.
Yeah, exactly right.
Well, Lola, thank you so much. I think it's exciting. I think it's fun, right? We talk a lot about abuse on my podcast because that's my audience and is survivors of. And there's so much more out there than just the focus of this narrow focus of abuse, that there is a life after.
There totally is. And it's better.
Yes. No matter how hard it is better in the after.
It absolutely is. Just take that first step.
Yep. Imperfect action. That's what I like to talk about. Imperfect action. Because not going to be perfect the first time you try it.
No. Unless you want to live that life forever. And that's how I looked at it. It's like, I can't do this. I can do this maybe for another month or a few more months, but I can't do this. I cannot live this way. No matter how much I loved my husband, I couldn't live that way. I did not want anyone to tell me what to do. Make suggestions, give me guidance. Okay. He was good in many ways. He didn't control my finances. He didn't stop me from seeing my friends or my relatives. He was very generous that way. He had demons that he needed to deal with himself.
Yeah.
And I wasn't helping.
By staying,
our relationship, right? Exactly.
Yeah, by staying wasn't helping.
Yeah. It wasn't helping anyone.
So, well, again, Lola, thank you so much. And we will have all of your information in the show notes as a part of this episode. So if you are driving, you don't have to stop and write anything down. You can just click the links in the show notes, and we will catch you on the next episode of the Rising Beyond podcast.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.